Hello, so I'm here today to go through my top 10 books that I read in 2015. These certainly are not books that were all published in 2013, but they are ones that I read for the first time, and they're the ones that I thought were the best of all the books that I read. I had a really good reading year this year. I read 109 books, which is well more than the 80 that I hoped to read this year. But technically I think I read 12 because the final book that I read in 2015 was a 4-book bind-up, so I kind of count that as 112, plus I reread some things and, you know, whatever. But there are some technicalities, but all in all, I read 109 books totally, and these are the top 10. I'm not going to rank them at all, I'm just going to tell you about them in the order in which I read them. Some of the books I have physical copies of, others I don't, so I will just insert a picture so you can see what the cover looks like. If you've read any of these books, please let me know what you thought of them, or if there are any books you would suggest for me to read based on what I enjoyed this year. So let's just get started. The first book I have is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. This was recommended to me by some friends for a long time until I finally read it for a book club that we kind of created for a semester at uni. This follows the brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde, who is a young Dominican American boy, and the really weird and crazy and dangerous things that he gets up to in his life. The voice of the narrator and the voice of the characters is absolutely excellent. It's one of the best narrations I've ever read, and it was just such a really exciting and adventurous story, and it's got some heartbreak at the end, so please prepare yourself for that. But I thought it was a really fantastic book, and it is the first on my list. Next is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This is an absolute mammoth of a novel. It's over 1,000 pages, at least the copy I read was, and it's the longest book I read this year, but it's probably the best book I read this year, or maybe in the top 2. It follows Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, who are magicians in Victorian England, and it follows how they meet and decide to re-establish magic as a profession and as a study in England at the time. It's got a lot of backstory about the rise and fall of magic as a practice in England, and it's just a really thrilling, really spooky, awesome novel. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's got a lot of magical realism, obviously, because it's about magicians, but I really think the 1,000 pages is worth reading, and I highly recommend you do it. I think it's one of the most gripping books I've ever read, and I loved it. The next book I have here is quite different from the first two. This is High Sobriety by Jill Stark. This is My Year Without Booze. This is a memoir written by Jill Stark about how she decided to take a year off from drinking after having way too many awful hangovers and wondering why she was doing it in the first place. As an Australian, I found this novel really, really interesting because I do think Australia has quite a unique relationship with alcohol and with drinking, especially around public holidays, and the idea of not drinking is seen as really taboo. I really enjoyed this, just seeing how she dealt with other people and how she came to terms with the idea of drinking in her own life and how it affected her and why she did it was really interesting, and I thoroughly enjoyed how in-depth she got with her emotional states and with her thought processes. I thought this was a really interesting read, and I highly recommend it to people who do or do not drink. I really enjoyed this memoir. Number 4 is another sort of memoir. This is more a memoir slash collection of essays, and this is The Fictional Woman by Tara Moss. Now, what really intrigued me about this when I first started reading it is I had no idea that Tara Moss used to be a model. I've only known her as a crime fiction writer. That's all I've ever known about her, and now I know that she's an academic and she's an ambassador for the UN and a fantastic woman. But I had no idea she was a model. So when I read the back that said that she had to take a lie detector test when she first started writing crime fiction because people didn't believe that she was intelligent enough to write stories, I was like already well into this. I was so excited to read it. This is one of the best collections of essays I have read. It's a really interesting look at how people talk about women, how people approach women and their experiences, especially in the media. As someone who has been in the media a lot, Tara has a really good insight into how people approach her knowing that she's a model, and how people approach her knowing now she is an incredibly intelligent and very talented woman. I ran into Tara Moss at my university the other day, and it was just like the weirdest moment ever, and I thoroughly appreciated her giving me the time of day. But I really admire this woman. I think this is an excellent collection of essays, really insightful, and backed up with a buttload of facts. So many statistics, so many secondary sources. Absolutely fantastic. I would recommend this if you've read anything by Tina Fey or Amy Poehler, or if you've read Bad Feminist, Lena Dunham's book, anything like that. If you're into it, I would recommend reading this one. Number 5 on my list of top 10 books of 2015 is the one that competes with Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell for the top spot. I'm not sure which one would take it. Maybe in a push I'd pick this one, but it's really too difficult to choose. This is William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. I have never read a Faulkner novel. I thought he was a bit too stuffy, I thought he was really old school, and I wasn't interested in going down that path. But I had to read this for class, and it absolutely blew me away. This follows a family going on the journey to bury their mother after she has died. It is multiple perspectives. Every chapter is told from a different family member's perspective, or some of their neighbors as well. I thought the dynamic between the characters was absolutely excellent. I thought all of the characters were heartbreaking and horrible and so lovable, and the things that happen to this family and the way that they keep going no matter what to bury their mother is nothing. It just compares to nothing. I think this is one of the best written novels I've ever read. The construction of it is second to none. Maybe it would be up with F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby or any of his novels. The way he constructs a narrative is also superb. The voice of each of these characters and the way he twists their dialogue and their thought processes is amazing. I'm just gonna keep talking about how much I love this novel, so I'll just stop and highly recommend you read this. It's a little bit difficult because the language is in dialect, but it's so beautiful, and if you read it and don't like it, I highly recommend you pick it up later, because I think it's one of the novels that ages really well. I read it twice this year and I wrote some essays on it. And it's in my top favorite books of all time. Loved it. Number 6 is a book I also don't have a physical copy of, and it was a collection of poems by Sylvia Plath. I'm talking about her collection Ariel, which is the first published, I think, of her poetry. I've never read a collection of Sylvia Plath poems, mostly because I didn't study her in high school, so I didn't need to stumble across her that way. But then it was just one of those things that you don't ever really get around to reading some of the classics. I decided to pick up Ariel and absolutely loved it. I don't think my opinion matters. I think everyone knows that Sylvia Plath is one of the greatest poets of all time. But it really blew me away how much I connected with her poetry and the way she constructs the sentences in the poems, and the way that she portrays how desperate and trapped the women in her poems are. It was really stunning, and I highly recommend that you read it even if you're not really into poetry. It's not scary, it's not hard. It was a really fantastic collection, and I would recommend that as well. The next book I have to talk about is one that is really talked about and hyped here on YouTube, and that's most of the reason why I picked it up. This is Volume 1 of Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. This is a bind-up of comics from Saga into one volume, so it's sort of a graphic novel, sort of a collection of comics. I picked this up again because most people were talking about it on YouTube, and I was really interested in trying some more comics and graphic novels, and I was thoroughly blown away by this story. The narrative voice of it, the driving plot line, the graphics are all superb. It follows this couple in the front. They're members of 2 warring planets who illegally run away from their planet and have a baby, and it follows the hunt that these 2 governments go through to find, capture, and ultimately kill these 2 absconders. I was really surprised by how much I loved this book, and I would highly, highly recommend it to anyone interested in trying out some comics or graphic novels, or people who want to read a really fantastic sci-fi plot. I have already got the second novel ready for me to read, and I can't imagine anything happening that would keep me from reading the rest of the series. I think it's really superb, really thrilling, really interesting, and one of the best books I read this year. Now I just realized that I completely messed up my order because I skipped the first book on my list. That's because I didn't have a physical copy of it, so accidentally completely skipped it. The first book I wanted to mention was We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves by Karen Joy Fowler. This received quite a bit of hype before it was published and then after it was released. It follows a family, mostly the daughter of this family, as she recounts how her family broke up and the difficulties that they had growing up and how that resulted in them losing touch with each other, or the difficulties they have now in adulthood. It has one of the most excellent twists I've ever read, mostly because I didn't know about it before I read it. I had no idea that there was even a twist, so when it finally came, it blew me away. It was probably one of the best literary moments I've ever read. The twist is that the main character's sister, who she spends most of the novel talking about, was actually a chimpanzee. So the story is based on the fact that in America, in I think the 60s and 70s, a few families volunteered to challenge the nature versus nurture debate and raise a chimpanzee baby as their own child. So this family in the novel have raised a daughter, and a human daughter and a chimpanzee daughter at the same time, to see what the experimental effects of that were. Obviously it didn't turn out as they had hoped, and this story is basically the aftermath of that. It's written non-chronologically, so it's a lot of flashbacks and flash forwards, and a lot of the times the narrator will tell you a story and then many chapters later tell you that she left bits out and then catch you up on the bits that she left out. It's a disjointed, difficult kind of narration to read, but I loved it. I thought it was really excellent, and it really kept me engaged the entire time. I didn't mind that she was so unreliable. I thought that was pretty much an effect of the trauma that she had experienced. It was really helpful for creating the narrative voice and for creating the tone of the entire story. I really enjoyed it. Again, also quite a heartbreaking ending and a lot of details about animal testing, so if that's something that upsets you or you're not interested in reading, I would skip this one. But if that sounds good to you, would highly recommend. Thoroughly enjoyed it with or without knowing that the twist is there. And now back into my actual order. This is the last book in my top 10 of 2015 and the one that I read most recently. This is The Natural Way of Things by Charlotte Wood. This, I think, is the only novel out of these ones that I've mentioned that was published in 2015, and it was published in Australia. Charlotte Wood is an Australian novelist. This is a story that follows two women who wake up in a semi-drugged state in what they feel is an asylum or a prison. They soon find out that it is more like a prison, and they're being held captive by two men and a woman with a group of women in their early 20s, so a group of young women. They don't know why they're there, and they don't know how they're going to get out or how long they're going to be there for, and it's quite scary in that way. It's kind of hinges on dystopian because they've been taken into the outback and are kept at a abandoned cattle station, and the combination of the isolation and the fact that they're surrounded by this really awful electric fence and are being beaten and abused by these horrible men and this one woman, it does hinge on the dystopian. What's excellent about this novel is it's a really minute examination of misogyny and the ways in which it manifests itself in everyday speech and action. The women are all kept there, or have all been taken there, because they've been survivors or victims of really famous sex scandals. And obviously some of them were victims, they were abused by the people they were involved in these sex scandals with. Some of them instigated them, but they're all receiving the same punishment because they are women who flaunt themselves, I suppose. Because the vast majority of the characters in this are women, it's a really good examination also of the way that women interact with other women, and the way that they form bonds and things like that, the way that you're expected to feel this sense of womanhood and shared oneness with other women, and sometimes you just don't. So while they have really shared experiences, they're also vastly different, and seeing how that manifests in the way they treat each other is really interesting. I read this really quickly. It's quite a fast read, but I think the description in it is great and the ending is fantastic, and I mean the whole premise of it is quite interesting as well. Especially I love the fact that it's Australian, it's written by an Australian woman and it's about Australian women. I think we don't see very much great Australian contemporary novels, and this is one of the best ones I've come across. So whether you read a lot of Australian fiction or whether you've never picked one up before in your life, I would recommend you try this one just because it's a bit different. So there you go, those are the top 10 novels that I read in 2015. Again, if you've read any of them, please let me know how you got on with them, if you liked them or not, or please recommend things based on what I enjoyed. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.